Hi, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this week's critical conversation, which is on the topic of museums and empire, and a very warm welcome back to those of you who were able to attend last week's session, which was on the collections. I just wanted to mention a couple of things for housekeeping. So if you would like to put up captions, you can go to the three dots on the menu on your screen, and they should appear there. I wanted also to remind you that we do have a chat function where you can post questions, which you can either direct to particular members of the panel or just in general, and we would love to hear your questions and we would love to answer them as well. So do keep them coming in. What we're going to do is we're going to follow the same format as last week. So I'll give a very brief introduction to our panelists tonight, and then we'll introduce the object that we'll be talking about a little bit. And then it's over to you guys for your questions. Each panel member is also going to give a very brief presentation just on their own perspectives and their own interests in the topic of museums and empires. And if you are looking to see which object we've chosen to talk about tonight, there should be a link coming up in the Q&A field for you so that you can check what it is that we're talking about. So this week we're going to be considering this image, which is a stone stele, which dates back to the 11th century. And this object entered the museum collection in 1839. It was donated by the Reverend James Patterson. He was educated at St Andrews, and then he spent his life as a missionary in India. And it originates from Bengal. And we'll be hearing more about that later, but just to give you a very brief introduction to that object. So to introduce our panelists tonight, my name's Emma Bond. I'll be moderating the conversation. I'm an academic here in the School of Modern Languages, and I'm very happy to be joined tonight by three panelists. We have Ananya Jain, who is the BAME, representing the BAME Student Network. Ananya has been really fundamental for designing and helping us to articulate what it is that we wanted to achieve with these conversations. So we're really grateful to have her here with us again this week. Thank you, Ananya. We've also got Elikem Logan, who's joining us representing the ACS. He is currently doing a MLit in Legal and Constitutional Studies at St Andrews. And we're also very lucky to have Dr Anindya Raychaudhuri with us from the School of English. He is the author of a very broad corpus of work that spans memory studies, post-colonialism and diaspora studies. He's written two recently published monographs, Homemaking, Radical Nostalgia and the Constitution of a South Asian Diaspora, and Narrating South Asian Partition, Oral History, Literature and Cinema. So we have a very rich range of interests here. And we're very grateful for everyone's participation. We perhaps will start with Ananya, just giving us a little bit of a brief introduction to her field of interest. Then we'll pass to Elikem and then to Anindya, if that's okay.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ananya, and as Amma said, I'm representing the BAME Students Network as the co-president of the recently created subcommittee. So I'm also studying art history and English, going into my third year now, and I'm originally from India. I think my primary interest in this broader concepts of museums and empire specifically looks into the legacies of empire in the forms of museums, so in formerly colonized countries, because that's been such a big part of my upbringing and my growing up, is how we, as like former colonial subjects or as a former colony, have a lot of museums here. And it's interesting to see how they were brought in by the colonial regime, and that's how they came into India. And I find it quite interesting going to these places now and seeing the colonial legacies, even in the structure, in the way, let's say, the museum exhibits are organized and things like that. But I think more specifically looking into the object we're going to be talking about today, what interests me about this is how, what are the consequences of putting a sacred object into a more secular space like a museum. So obviously this stone stele is a Shiv and Parvati, it's a it's a sacred object, and it has a very specific connotation religiously for particular religions in India. And I think I'm quite keen to understand what kind of effects that putting this sacred object that has so much of significance and it has a lot of symbolism into this place that is considered quite secular. So what kind of consequences that have for the object itself, like the identity of the object, whether it is still a sacred object or it's transformed into something secular because it's in a secular space, and what it also does for the viewers, so the person who comes to see it, whether that person is aware of the context. For someone who is aware of the context, how easy or difficult it is to detach themselves from that previous context and look at it purely in artistic terms or in technical terms. And how should we generally treat such objects, right? Do we signpost them better? Do we give better context into their religious background? Or do we treat them as something separately? And I think here what becomes quite relevant is specifically looking at sacred objects in from religions where in countries or in museum spaces where they represent a minority religion. So, for instance, objects of the broader, like South Asian culture in Western museums, for instance, broadly, and how that plays out and how then the context becomes different. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Elikem. I am a postgraduate student at the University of St. Andrews. My undergraduate was in art history and management, and I wrote my dissertation on Ghana's premier participating pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Art. So a lot of my sort of research interest has been on the legacy of colonialism, on the cultural capital that's Ghana, where I'm from, and the subject of my dissertation, the cultural capital that has been accrued by the nation since independence, and the outlook from sort of the outside looking in, how the global art scene has responded to Ghana's cultural development, specifically within the purview of fine arts. And I mean, in relation to how this sort of would link in with this conversation, I'm very much concerned with colonial legacy as well, and a lot of the objects which to this day are still sort of the most revered African artworks are sacred objects as well. And that has meant that in some ways they are given sort of more sort of praise, and in other ways the artists who make them, the makers of these objects, are very much removed of their agency and not really seen as artists as well. And I'm interested in definitely in the role that the museum has to play in how these objects are perceived, and how much of an acknowledgement there is in the sort of provenance of these objects. But I'm also interested in the final sort of cultural capital which is given to the nation as a result of the encounter with the object, and I find that the museum as well has a big part to play in this. But how is it possible that a museum outside of the nation's sort of sovereign bounds can actually be part of this process of allowing the country to be seen in a more positive light, or the artist to be seen as to be given more agency from a global perspective? So yeah, that's really the main focus for me.
Hi. So thanks for inviting me. Thanks for asking me to speak. My name is Anindya, as Emma said. I work in the School of English. I work on empire, on identity, on a number of different things. I come from Bengal. I grew up in Bengal. I grew up in the part of the world where this object comes from. So it has a personal connection to me in a sense. So I thought I'd start with a personal anecdote that in a sense connects to the object. So the object shows two divine figures, Shiva and Parvati. They're a couple. you may know Hinduism is it's an object of Hindu worship. Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. It has multiple gods and goddesses, but it's the same divine force taking different forms. So Parvati, the goddess figure, there is another goddess figure, Durga, Kali, Chamunda. All of these are different forms. Now, as a 7-year-old boy trying to understand Hinduism, I'd known that Shiva was married to Durga, and I knew that Shiva was married to Kali. So I apparently asked my dad how come Shiva had multiple wives, and my dad tried to explain to me that this was, this is how Hinduism works. It's the same force taking different forms. And I thought about it a bit, and I asked him if it was like the Transformers. That's a 7-year-old son of atheist communists trying to understand Hinduism. But I think there is a serious point here, because objects do transform. Objects change through history. The past, the present adhere to the objects in different ways as it passes through time. I'm not a historian. I'm not interested in establishing the truth factor origin point of an object, but I'm interested in the changing politics of how it means, of what it means as it travels. It came to St. Andrews in 1839, as Emma said, from West Bengal, specifically from the town Murshidabad, which was, not incidentally, the seat of power of the Nawabs of Bengal. Perhaps the most famous name of the Nawabs of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, who lost the Battle of Plassey. That was roughly 80 years before Reverend Patterson found this object. And that Battle of Plassey is the first big battle, Britain's first big victory in the Indian subcontinent. 200 years after that, at the end of the British Empire in India, Murshidabad again becomes a significant figure, because it's one of the districts that most people expected would have gone to Pakistan. As the Indian subcontinent splits, the Muslim majority provinces were supposed to go to Pakistan. So Murshidabad was a district that, would have been expected to go to Pakistan. But it becomes part of India. India itself changes through the years, so that the same Hinduism that this object embodies starts to become crystallized as a rigid political ideology, a Hindu nationalism that many, including me, would argue that is taking India from democracy to the brink of fascism. Now, none of this could have been anticipated by the person who made the object. We don't know who made the object. The archive is incomplete, but the incompleteness is not a matter of accident. It is no coincidence that we know Reverend Patterson's name and we don't know the name of the person who made it. Because when it comes to St. Andrews, it represents empire. It represents accumulation, the transfer of material resources from the colony to the metropole. In other words, there is power and hierarchy in meanings. And in our debates about what should be done with these objects now, I think the starting point of the debate has to be a recognition that an object like this does not just represent a legacy of empire, but it represents material benefit to Britain today. In other words, what would British tourism look like without the British Museum? Right? So the fact it's more than just an echo or a legacy of empire. It's also a continuing hierarchy in the present. The other thing I read in the object is emotions. The poignancy of the loving look between the two figures. Might it reflect the love between a person and an object and land, for example? For me, it reminds me of home. It reminds me of, perhaps, especially in the current climate, it reminds me of being far away from home and the longing to return. Objects evoke emotions. Again, none of this was intended, but these meanings adhere to the object. So in its transition from an object of worship to an object of empire to an object of debate or decolonization, none of the earlier meanings ever get completely lost. They just get layered on with new ones. They change, and yet they remain the same. So basically, the long and short of it was 7-year-old me was right. They're transformers.
Thank you very much, all three of you, for those really interesting introductions, in a sense, and contextualization also of both the discussion and the object. A reminder to send in your questions, your comments, your thoughts as well in the audience. We can see them, but they are anonymized, so feel free to ask and say whatever you like. I wondered if we could pick up a bit on what Anindya was just saying about the changing kind of value that adheres to the object, you said, but it's also something that you know, the object might have an agency at the same time as the people who are taking care of that object, the people that are curating it, displaying it, and also consuming it in a certain sense. I think it's really interesting that you all picked up on the fact that there is not just a cultural value, but there is an economic value. There is a kind of, as Elikem said, a kind of cultural capital that also travels around with these objects, right? And that is a continuing sort of benefit of the metropole in a sort of, if we want to say, a post-imperial system. But again, we have this sense of incompleteness. This is an incompleteness that, as Anindya said, is not undeliberate. It again replicates sort of systems. So what do we do with this object in a very kind of, you know, in a context where it doesn't belong, in a context where it is not necessarily perceived in a way that it was made to be perceived or experienced? How should we display this object? What should we do with it? You know, there are lots of objects like it, even in a collection such as that of St Andrews. So what do we do with them? Ananya, I don't know whether you want to come in first.
I think that's a very interesting question with no one answer. But personally, I think one thing that I think is quite important is recognizing these multiple contexts of the object, because and I generally think that, and I think the shift is taking place, but museums as spaces, and specifically, you know, the information you're given about these objects and the displays should be challenging for the viewer and should open the viewer up to this idea that there are these multiple interpretations. So what may be written on a particular label or information about the object exists, but it's not the only thing. And as viewers, we need to go beyond that, because I think we were talking about the same objects, but even in this discussion, even in this short period of time, we were able to bring so many facets into discussion. We were able to talk about so many different aspects of it. And I think one thing, therefore, is very necessary, I think, in a case where it is displayed or it is put up in a museum setting, is acknowledging these different facets and designing, let's say, displays or designing labels or captions for these objects that bring those to notice. I know it's not an easy task to do because there are so many different things to consider, but I think one problem I often see when it comes to objects like this is very vague signposting and very, like for instance, Hindu object in stone, or quite vague titles. And I guess obviously that means that there is a lot of context behind it, but I think more context and questioning would be nicer than a vague title that kind of takes away all of that context and leaves it as that one single object as what you can see, because there's more than what you can see just on the surface level. So I know that's a bit of a vague answer, but I think it should there should be questions evoked in the mind of the viewer.
Yeah, I totally agree, actually, and I think some of the more successful examples of label writing that I've seen recently have precisely acknowledged the gaps in understanding, the gaps in context, but also kind of asked questions of the visitors as well. Because what we're all saying is that it is a responsibility for museums essentially to try and provide these kind of multiple interpretations or multiple perspectives on objects. But I wonder what you all think about what kind of strategies museums can enact in order to communicate those kind of multiplicities. I mean, you know, co-creation, co-curation, kind of allowing in different voices into interpretation. I mean, these go some way towards addressing perhaps elements of amnesia or asphasia, as other people have termed it, in relation to a colonial or imperial past. But how far can they go towards addressing those issues? I don't know whether Elikem, you want to come in on this one.
Sure. I think co-curation and sort of, collaborating in that sense to add more context to the work, or allow people who might have more of a personal connection to works like these to be part of the story I think is definitely, especially from the context of a museum which already has the possession of a piece like this and doesn't kind of, and it's already in your possession, before whatever had happened for it to be there. I think that's kind of one of the most important things you can do. Just because I think that these objects, if you kind of remove them from the context, or you remove them from what the closest person to the object might actually, what it might mean to them, then it's not really serving its purpose. If these things are relics and souvenirs of empire, and people have brought them from around the world so that British people might have more of a world view, and it's important that you actually try and enhance the viewers. It's important for the viewer and important for the museum that you try and enhance the world view of that one individual coming through, or else it is nothing else but a relic of empire. In terms of curating a space, so I think that's what, for me, that's what the purpose of museums are. You have this sort of blank canvas in this meta sense, which you can pass ideas through, using objects, and whatever you put next to the work, whatever you put beside it, above it, whatever context is, spatial context is there when the work is being experienced, you can actually condition that experience, as the museum, as the showing body. And it's important that, because that exists, there should be an acknowledgement and an exploitation of that to make the experience, as sort of palatable as possible to people who do understand now what negative experiences might have arisen from actually the object's presence. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm also really interested, and Anindya, I don't know whether you want to come in on this, reading recent work by Ariella Azoulay, who talks about how the displacement of objects is related, obviously, to the displacement of people as well, and how the movement of objects outside of their sort of their own context can't be removed from a sense that that people have also been displaced in the same way, and there has been a sort of forced separation, if you like, from people and the objects that culturally respond to the places where they were originally from. And I wonder what you think about objects sort of being far from home. I mean, you've spoken about your own kind of personal reflections on this piece, but this is, to bring it back to this particular object, this is an object that's now in St Andrews. What kind of work can be done to sort of to do something to address that sense of displacement that the object might kind of have accumulated through these various processes that you've spoken about?
Thanks for that. It's a good big question. So I don't know if I'll be able to answer it. I don't know if I'll be able to do it justice, as it were. I agree completely with what's been said so far. More context, co-curating, more equitable curating, as it were. All of those things are important and necessary. I guess I'll have two things to say. One is, museums can't be afraid of conflict. If the context can't simply be an extraneous, artificial dampening down of conflict to imagine some greater kind of humanity, right? We need to be upfront about the violence that has led to objects and people being moved against their will. So that and that's a big thing, right? To to be clear about one's liabilities and the responsibility one has, both as an institution, if the institution is old, like St Andrews, or and also as in terms of the geographical, national, nation state context, for example. So recognizing one's liabilities and being clear about the violence, the genocide, the cultural, both cultural and physical genocide that has gone into taking these these objects and moving them. And the second point I'd make, and maybe it is a slightly more depressing point, but I think it needs to be said, which is, even though it is really, really important to get museums to be better at providing context, if a museum on its own could undo empire, we wouldn't be still having this conversation, right? And I think that matters, right? So we can and we need to have a chat about what is the best way to display an object that is a legacy of empire. But if we don't include in that conversation, how are BIPOC people getting job opportunities in the museums in the today, right? Who are the people who are in positions of power? What is the pay differential between people of white people and people of color? What is the pay differential between men and women? If the spaces, the structures of the institution within which this object lives, if those structures are experienced to be racist, then the bit of text next to the object doesn't really matter.
That's a fantastic answer. Thank you for reflecting on that, because it's so much of what's important about, you know, when it's easy, as we've all said, for museums perhaps to come out with statements and to do window dressing in various ways, but essentially structures are racist and structures are violent, and there needs to be an acknowledgement of that as well. So thank you. We have a question in which I'll share with you. Somebody asks, to what extent is it acceptable to a secular museum, to the communities from which the items come, to use the religious or sacred items on display in an act of worship, devotion or ritual by their communities, either in the museum space or elsewhere? So I suppose going back to that idea that, Ananya, you were talking about, this idea of the shifting kind of function, if you like, from sacred to aesthetic, and what would happen if that function were to be kind of multiplied as well within the museum space. I don't know whether you want to talk to that one.
I mean, I would like to, but I also want to hear everyone else's views on this. Personally, I don't know, because I think religion as a matter and as a concept is quite sensitive still. Specifically, I mean, where this object comes from, it is a very sensitive matter, and we can see that currently in India. And also, I think it's also something very personal. So, and so is an act of worship or a ritual, as it were. And I also think that, I guess, so yeah, it is quite personal. So it would also be a very personal context. And I wonder whose approval you would take for that, or who would you want to direct this question towards, right? Because yes, a religious community exists, but it doesn't really exist as a whole. I believe like there is no consensus you can take from a religious community as a whole. For instance, if we take this object, for example, and this were to be used in some sort of ritual, in whatever way it were to, who would this question be directed to, in the sense that there is no massive Hindu community that you can take this consensus or this vote from. I think it's quite personal. That said, I also think there is different kind of ritual specificity when it comes to religious objects. So there is that concept of who performs the ritual, what is the ritual, whether that upsets some people or it doesn't. So I don't think there is a correct answer to this, because it really depends on the sensibilities of the people viewing it and watching it. One thing I would like to think about, though, is that is the museum the space for that ritualization in a very religious context, because I don't know where I was reading this, but in the past, museums themselves have been linked to this idea of a temple because of the way they function and the process you go through where you go into the museum and you look at these objects, and it is a secular temple, but it has been compared to a temple, as it were. But I feel like what is the purpose of that object in that museum is important to consider, and whether that is a ritualistic or religious purpose, I don't know. So I don't have an answer for this. I think it's quite specific, but I would like to know what everyone else thinks about it.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right about the temple thing, and I think that was also a deliberate kind of construction of the museum as an imperial project, right? It's, you know, it's obvious in the architecture of the great old museums like the Louvre or the British Museum. They're set up as a kind of as a temple. Elikem, I don't know whether you want to. I mean, Ananya said she wanted to hear from everyone on this question, so I don't know whether you you want to jump in as well.
I'll try and respond to this question. It's very interesting, and you know, as you pointed out, there are a variety of ways you could approach this, and there's no one expected outcome. I mean, from my personal experience with these questions, they've been from the perspective of things like the Benin bronzes in Nigeria, and sacred objects made in shrines for various animistic African ethnicities, which were then looted. And you know, for someone who actually has the full project of colonialism has taken effect on me to the extent that I am Christian, and I think that my sort of I've been taught to sort of approach indigenous religions from where I come from with suspicion, and I would say that this is definitely the majority of people more than the minority. So in that sense, actually, these objects might never be returned, might never be used in the same way, and in that sense their value might be purely aesthetic, and as ritualistic sort of objects they might never actually take that shape again, and that in its own self is a relic of empire, that phenomenon. But I think that there's also something to be said for, I mean, even the people who do practice these faiths and would necessarily use objects like these. There are, at least I know in some religions, there's this whole aspect of what are you actually worshipping? Are you using the object as sort of a medium through which to worship a deity which you can't, you know, talk, and which you can't actually touch? And if you lay so much importance on the object, then what does that say about the deity behind that? So it might actually be devaluing the deity to place so much importance on an object which in some sense has gone to another shrine, has gone to another temple, and might actually be no longer fit for purpose anymore for worship, and kind of soiled by being in another space. And if I think that's another question in and of itself. You know, once they are in the museum, are they no longer fit for purpose? Have you kind of downgraded them into only secular temple worship? And yeah, I mean, that's just the whole angle, but yeah, it's interesting.
It's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. And Anindya, I don't know whether you have anything that you want to add on that, or anything that's
it reminds so across most of northern India, you know, including where this object is from, the local word for a museum literally translates as house of magic, Jadughar, house of magic, or wonder house. And I think that there's something about that sense of magic and wonder, the awe-inspiring nature of a museum that is absolutely connected to its imperial power. right? That is what it was designed to do. It was designed to inspire awe in the local population. And part of the way it inspires awe is it changes the meaning of, you, the local illiterate peasant, don't know what this object means. Me, the white man in charge, with my armor of knowledge, of Western knowledge, I am able to tell you what this means, right? And of course, we said earlier on about the incompleteness of the archive. The incompleteness and the difficulty of access of the archive means that is actually the case, right? So as the kind of work I do, I know this, a lot of my colleagues know this. If you are going to do any kind of archival research on South Asia, for example, the place to do it is London, because that's where the archives are, right? So in the transition from taking an object of faith or an object of worship or a religious object, however you want to describe it, to a secular object is a change of knowledge, is a change of knowledge structure. So given, as has been said before, given the object is there now, given it may not be suitable for its original purpose as a religious object, I guess what then is important is who gets to describe the object now, who gets to speak about the object now, who gets to define its meaning now. And this comes back to the point that Elikem was making about co-curation, right? Do we, wherever possible, include the voices of those who are more directly connected to the object than the Reverend Patterson was?
Absolutely. We've got another question in, which I think is initially for Elikem. It's in response to your comment. It is important for the viewer and the museum that you enhance the worldview of that viewer, or else it is nothing other than a relic of empire. Do the panel have thoughts on what the first steps need to be to achieve this? So again, another just small question. Elikem.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and respond, but I think maybe what an important first step would be something like what has already been said, to sort of ensure that it goes beyond, to make sure that people actually, the people who know about this, the people who directly benefit from an increase in the importance of these objects, are the people who actually get to define, the objects and define the objects' importance. It's actually exactly the case for most countries in Africa that if you want to do any archival work, the best place to go is in London. In fact, all the way up until early independence, one of my friends was writing an EPQ for her A-level, and she needed a 1957 report on judicial corruption, and that was the year Ghana became independent. And the only place in the world that report is, even though she went to the National Archives of Ghana and it wasn't there, and it was in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And it's funny enough because, that is the main problem. That's what I mean by sort of the accrual of cultural capital, is of course these objects, having them with you there is a sort of a value to that in raw numbers in terms of tourism. How many objects does the British Museum have? 6 million or so, and they make a lot of money just off of that premise alone. But then on another level, regardless of who has the object, the way that you write about it, the way that it's described, the agency you give to the makers, rather than seeing them as sort of primitive contemporaries who you could have picked one out of a million from those times in Africa, and anyone would have been able to make you these carved objects, but they're all dead now, so they're geniuses. That is sort of anachronistic to what we know about art and making, full stop, anywhere. So we need to start being honest about things like that, and giving agency to these people and seeing them as people who have a very specific worldview, who are making things which reflect this, and you have to go to this place to experience this, or to experience sort of the echoes of it, and then we'll start to see a system, I think, where for instance, the objects might be able to stay in the British Museum, but people will still recognize that you want to go to Benin to see, you know, where the context lies, and there might be a museum dedicated to that, but the Benin bronzes might still be able to stay in Britain, and it might actually benefit both people, you know. A system, I think, yeah, I think that's where we, you know, try to start to sort of repair those bonds, you know, by actually grabbing those countries and grabbing onto that history and saying, you know, we are a part of that. St. Andrews does have something in connection to Bengal now, and we should like grab onto that title and actually try and make that, you know, more apparent, rather than removing St. Andrews from the narrative and leaving them in this void, because the void, in the void, you actually only end up benefiting St. Andrews and no one else.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really valuable point to make. I'm going to move on from that one just because we have another question that I'd like at least one of you to address. So somebody asks, do we think there is a danger in using this object to place colonialism in the past, masking contemporary neo-colonial structures? And Anindya, you're smiling, so you get the question first.
I assume the person wants an answer longer than yes. But I mean, yes is my answer. I guess the issue then is, how do we stop that, or how do we undo contemporary neocolonial structures? I guess one way to do it, and I was thinking this in response to the earlier question about enhancing a worldview. There's a particular academic way to phrase it, so I'll do that, and then I'll try and explain what I mean. If we are going to try to decolonize knowledge, which is what I think we are talking about, we can't decolonize knowledge without making knowledge interdisciplinary. In other words, if we are going to situate knowledge within its disciplinary structures, right? This is history, this is philosophy, this is literature, this is chemistry, biology, whatever. That can never lead to decolonized knowledge. So if we go back to this object specifically, if we insist on an archival truth as the yardstick to decide what our context is, then we will do exactly what the questioner suggests, reinforcing neocolonial structures. If instead we include mythology, we include stories that have been handed down, where the yardstick isn't is this true with a capital T, but the yardstick is this important? You know, what important emotional political work is this knowledge doing in the present? And then we include fables, we include spiritual texts, we include religious texts, we include the perspective of people who may not know how to read and write, we include music, and it is a big job. It is a big job, but it's a job that universities especially need to be doing, which is to if we are going to break down the borders between the global south and the global north, let's say, they have to be accompanied with breaking down disciplinary borders and producing knowledge that is more fluid than the disciplinary silos within which we work.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. I'm going to move on because we have one last question that I would just like us to respond to, and it's going back to the conversation that Ananya started around the object and the significance, which I think is a really important question, particularly for this object in this context. So the significance of religious individuals, missionaries in particular, collecting religious objects, so objects of other religions, essentially. What do you think the motivations were in collecting the objects belonging to religions they were trying to convert people from? So Ananya, I don't know whether you want to, I'm not saying to answer the question because it's again, it's another big question for the 1 minute we have left, but just reflecting perhaps again on that idea that, you know, these objects had values and a different value, right, for a missionary than perhaps a collector or an archaeologist or what have you.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's something I personally know very little about. I would like to acknowledge. Obviously, I have no ways to verify this or know the actual purpose of a missionary collecting an object like this. But I would also like to believe there was a lot of curiosity involved in that kind of act as well. So I don't know if we know whether this object was particularly got because of its religious significance or because of its artistic value. But it is interesting that it was brought back by a missionary. I think there is more to learn about that, or about the motivation of a person like this bringing a specific object like this back. And I guess that's another facet of knowing more about the object and how that changes its significance when it comes to a different context. For instance, when it comes to St. Andrews, and how that particular carrier of the object influences the way people view it. So is that person like necessarily vilified, or are the intentions of that person necessarily negative or bad in that context, or is it something that came with that colonial aspect of curiosity, and because he had power in that respect, he could bring that object back? So again, like, I don't have an answer for it, but I think it is interesting to consider the power dynamic behind that, and perhaps alternative motivations that came just within being in that context and being like a person who is there and who has that power to actually bring this object back or look at this object, or whether they looked at it in a religious context or in an artistic context. Because I know there was a lot of comparison between Indian sculpture and Western sculpture also. And in a way, Indian sculpture was considered less like other forms of any forms of colonial art. So again, that's another aspect I think we can learn more about or look more into, and how that, I guess, transforms the object, as we were talking about before.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll wrap things up now because we've come to the end of the conversation. I just wanted to thank again the three panelists for contributing so powerfully to the conversation tonight. And a reminder that we have our third critical conversation next Tuesday, slightly later time at 7:30, and that will be on the topic of futures. And last thing, do keep an eye out for some creative prompts which are going to appear on the Countdown channel, which will provide another way for you to respond to this evening's discussion in what we hope will be an open-ended and creative way. So thank you very much again, everybody, for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you all next week. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.